Miss Tarkington's Agricultural Mechanics and Metal Technologies class. Today we will be covering the procedures and safety uses of the oxyacetylene apparatus. First, let's go over the personal protective equipment, otherwise known as PPE. First, let's start off with the long sleeve shirts. Make sure that you are always wearing long sleeve shirts whenever you're welding or doing oxyacetylene cutting in the shop, because you want to make sure that you're protecting your arms. Second, let's make sure you're wearing those long pairs of jeans. Make sure that there are no holes or no frays in them. Remember, if a spark touches the frays, it could quickly catch your jeans on fire. Thirdly, let's make sure you are wearing those leather boots. Alright, let's go into safety goggles now, or safety glasses. You can wear these clear safety glasses. Another option is also these Shade 5 darkening glasses for oxyacetylene cutting. You can also use these, but these are honestly a bit uncomfortable, so choose what best suits you the most. Now, if you wanted to wear a welding hood, you could, but you would really have to use the auto darkening hood. That would best suit this. The non-auto darkening one would simply be too dark, and you wouldn't be able to see. Now, gloves are also essential, so make sure you're wearing a pair of leather gloves whenever you are doing oxyacetylene. Now, continuing on with the safety. Anytime you move the tanks, you want to make sure that you always keep the cap on whenever you're moving it. Because if the tank was to fall, it could shear off this valve, causing considerable damage to the shop. Alright, now let's get into the equipment that we will be using today. Right here on the left, we have the oxygen tank, and here on the right, we have the acetylene tank. And the regulators to the right of me, we have the oxygen regulator and the acetylene regulator, which is attached to the hose, the torch body, the cutting torch, and it's used for cutting. Next, we will be moving on to some of our different attachments that we will be using. This right here is the cutting torch attachment, which is used for cutting. This one here is our heating attachment, which is used for heating and bending. And lastly, this attachment is the welding attachment, which is used for welding. Some other equipment we'll be using today is a striker to light our flame, a filler rod, and metal for working. A few other things that we may need in this skill today is the Victor manual to set the pressure on our gauges. Now this is optional, but these are cleaning tips so that if you see any inconsistencies with your flame, you can use these on any types of torch tips. Then we have soap and water to check if there are any leaks. So now we're going to start by setting up our equipment for the day. Here we have our oxygen regulator and our acetylene regulator. Let's start off with the oxygen regulator first. So first off, we want to make sure that we're staying very level when we are threading this, because we don't want to create any leaks. Make sure that you're threading it clockwise when you're putting on the oxygen regulator. All right, now that it's tight, we're just going to take our wrench and secure it. And it's on. Now let's move on to our acetylene regulator. This one's a little bit different than the oxygen regulator because you want to make sure that you are going counterclockwise when threading it on. Again, just like the oxygen, you want to make sure that you're keeping it level so that you don't create any leaks. Now that our acetylene regulator is tight, we're just going to do the same thing that we did with the oxygen, and we're just going to make sure to tighten it with the wrench. Again, going counterclockwise. It's on there good. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and open our systems. But before we open them all the way, we want to make sure that there is pressure in the oxygen tank before we begin. So let's crack the valve. Seeing that there's pressure, let's go ahead and open it up all the way. Should be open all the way. Okay, now that our oxygen tank is fully open, now we're gonna move on to our acetylene. Acetylene, the valve is a little bit different than the oxygen. It is crucial that we only open the pressure valve open to just a half turn, because if there was an emergency, we would need to be able to close it very quickly. So let's only turn it just a little bit.
Half turn.
Now we're gonna go ahead and set the pressure for our two tanks. You can refer back to the Victor manual to set the PSI, but to make this activity a little bit easier today, I'm just gonna go ahead and set it at the recommended 30 to 35 PSI for the oxygen. So let's do the oxygen first. All right, now that the oxygen is set, we're gonna move on to our acetylene, which the recommended PSI is between 5 and 7. Now that we have pressurized our systems, let's now make sure that there are no leaks. We're gonna check for leaks using our non-petroleum water and soap-based mixture. Now we're going to check our cutting torch to see if there's any leaks in there as well. Seeing that there are none, we can now move on into using our cutting torch. Okay, so before we begin using our cutting torch, we want to make sure that we familiarize ourselves with the cutting torch attachment itself. This right here is oxygen number 1. This over here is the acetylene valve. This is oxygen number 2. And then this attachment right here is our oxygen. So first we're gonna go ahead and open up oxygen number 1 all the way. And then we're just gonna barely crack the acetylene valve. We're not gonna open up oxygen number 2 yet, that will come. Okay, so I went ahead and turned off our acetylene so that I could show y'all just what we're exactly going to be doing today. I'll give a demonstration. But first, once we crack our acetylene, we are going to take our striker and we're going to ignite the flame. Once the flame is ignited, we can go ahead and turn up our acetylene and adjust to it as needed. Make sure that the tip is not too far from the flame, and also make sure that there's not too much smoke coming out of the tip. Okay, now we're gonna get into the process of lighting our torch, but first let's make sure that we have all of our proper PPE on. We wanna make sure that we have our shade 5 glasses on, as well as our leather gloves. All right, first we're gonna go and crack our acetylene, just a little bit. Now that we've cracked our acetylene, we're gonna take our striker and ignite the flame. Seeing that we have a little bit of smoke, we're going to open our acetylene more. But now seeing that we have too much flame and that the torch tip is going out further than the flame, that means we have too much acetylene. So we're gonna turn it down just a bit. Okay. Now that we have our acetylene flame going, now we're gonna open up oxygen number 2 so that we can actually get our So to re-demonstrate with the oxygen number 2, we brought the flame back to where there was a neutral flame to where you could barely see the tips. Now we have a nice neutral tip. If there's too much hissing, then that means you have too much oxygen, so you need to bring it back. This is about where we should have it. Now that we have our neutral flame, we're going to be cutting this piece of metal. So first, we want to make sure that we heat our flame first till it gets red hot. Once it gets red hot on the metal, we will push down on our oxygen lever to separate the metal. Make sure that you are keeping a steady hand whenever you're cutting down the metal. That way, the metal actually cuts through. Now onto the other side. Again, make sure you have a slow and steady hand. But if you go too slow, then it'll reheat back up. So you just want to make sure you find what tape is best for you. And now we've used our cutting torch. Now that we're done using our cutting torch, we're going to go ahead and shut off the flame. Make sure that you do it in reverse order of what we set it up as. So first, let's shut off our oxygen number 2. Then our acetylene. Now we're going to go ahead and start off by turning off all of our pressure tanks. So first we did our oxygen and then we did our acetylene. Now we're going to grab our cutting torch and release the oxygen. That we turned off our pressure tanks. Now we're going to go ahead and bleed the lines. First we're going to do acetylene first. Go ahead and crack it. Now that our acetylene is at 0, we're going to go ahead and bleed the oxygen line. So let's go ahead and release some pressure from our oxygen lever. Now that our pressures are at 0 for oxygen and acetylene, we're going to go ahead and release any unwanted pressure so that it's good for next time's use. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. Just to recap on all the things that we covered safety, proper PPE, setting up our regulators and our torch, using different cutting techniques, as well as turning off all of our equipment. Please join me next time on using oxyacetylene with heating, bending, and welding. See y'all later.